Top Russian and American officials met in Saudi Arabia and have meeting today to begin talks on improving ties and negotiating an end to the war in Ukraine. The meeting in Riyadh marks another pivotal step by the Trump administration to reverse US policy on isolating Russia and is meant to pave the way for a meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, although it doesn't seem like a date on that has actually been agreed. The timetable for ending the war in Ukraine seems to be that the Trump administration want this done by Easter. In Turkey, President Zelensky met with President Erdogan.
Ukraine is not participating. Ukraine knew nothing about it. Ukraine regards any negotiations on Ukraine without Ukraine as negotiations with no result. And we cannot acknowledge anything, any arrangements about us that were made without us, and we will not recognize such agreements.
Back here, Keir Starmer has warned President Trump that US security guarantees are the only way of preventing Russian aggression in the future, arguing that it is more than just about the future of Ukraine, but, quoting here, it is an existential question for Europe as a whole and therefore vital for Britain's national interests. He said, "This is a once-in-a-generation moment for the collective security of our continent. It is a new era in which nations cannot cling hopelessly to the comforts of the past." What are those comforts of the past? Aren't those comforts of the past the reason why European powers find themselves basically reduced to being the 51st state of America? The comforts that meant Europe failed to take responsibility for its own protection after the fall of the USSR and the end of the Cold War, the comfort that allowed German and French leaders for years to believe that it was the end of history, that Russia was not a threat, that the biggest industrial power in Europe could become incredibly reliant on Russian energy despite growing expansionism from Russia in the late 2000s and 2010s. European leaders decided that we didn't need to worry about the security guarantees of the new states in the East because, one, broadly, America would sort it, and two, we'd convinced ourselves that we were the peace continent. So when Keir Starmer talks about the beginning of a new era and the end of old comforts, what is he describing? 03456060973. Brett Bruen is a former US diplomat for the White House under the Obama administration, joins me live. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. I wonder what you think Keir Starmer is referring to there about old comforts.
Well, I think Europe broadly has relied on the United States to be the guarantor of security, stability standards across the continent, around the world. And look, going back to the president that I served under, Barack Obama, we have been saying Europe has got to take more responsibility, including, let's be honest here, the United Kingdom, which has allowed year after year for its defense forces to be depleted. And at a time when, Trump came into office in 2016, he was harping on this point. He was saying, Europe, you've got to do more. And at that time, we didn't have European territory that had been invaded. We didn't have an aggressive China. We didn't have many of the threats from, across Africa, the Middle East, let alone, what I think is the clearest and the most present danger in an emboldened Vladimir Putin. And so the notion that for the better part of the last 3 years, Europe has not been in emergency mode is unacceptable. And, in that score, I agree with President Trump. They have got to step up.
The difficulties that European nations have had in bolstering their defences can be traced back to the financial crash of 2008-9, the Eurozone crisis in 2012, where budgets got very, very severely stretched. I wonder to what extent you think that there was a view taken in European capitals that Europe was probably safe because there was no Cold War, that the USSR had broken up. It was all over.
I think there was that view. I think there also, quite frankly, has not been a culture of defense across many European countries. I was recently in a large one speaking with senior officials, and they were sharing the challenge of trying to put forward a larger defense budget because there is that tough history with the military, with spending on defense. And yet, you pose to them the question, How are you going to deal with, whether it's Russia, whether it's challenges that come from North Africa? We've seen extremist group in the wake of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, in the wake of what has transpired in Syria, as well as across Africa, North Africa itself. It is important that there is a realization that we are clear-eyed about the world in which we live, because the threats are only metastasizing. They're only getting bigger, and, regularity of risk is a feature of our daily life.
You were saying earlier that you were at the Munich Security Conference the other day. What was the feeling in the room when the Vice President of the United States stood up and basically told Europe that they'd been getting it all wrong?
I think it was one of outrage. I think it was, even though the expectations were quite low, the fact that Vance had the temerity to lecture Europeans, to lecture Germans on freedom of speech in a country that has lived the dangers of extremist speech. I mean, it was, quite frankly, historic amnesia. And it is being practiced and preached again and again by folks in the Trump administration. I think it's dangerous for Europe because they are going to continue. If that was the core message that Vance came to Munich with, it wasn't, let's work together on Ukraine. It wasn't even, let's work together on China. It was, you all have got freedom of speech wrong.
Do you think that there can be a deal arranged without including European nations?
No, because we've already heard that the expectation of the American administration is Europe is going to pony up troops, pony up treasure. But also the fact of the matter is that this more acutely impacts Europe. I mean, there are reports that Putin's next test is going to be in the Baltics, that he will test whether or not, and I think Pete Hegseth, the U.S. Defense Secretary, called into question Article 5, the notion that the U.S. would come to the defense of an ally that's been threatened. And it was interesting. We had a conversation on our Global Affairs podcast, One Decision, about this, where the Canadian defense minister told us, we have shed blood. We have shed blood in Afghanistan. We've shed blood here in Europe alongside Americans. And so the notion that somehow Donald Trump is coming in and is trashing a trade deal that he negotiated, is trashing an alliance that has held the world together for so long, is not just offensive, it's outrageous.
Really good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. Brett Bruen, former US diplomat for the White House under the Obama administration.